This is Debt Free in 30. Here's your host, Doug Hoyes.
So what do you do when you find yourself in that position where you got too much debt? So since this show is called Debt Free in 30, I thought, hey, why don't we talk about the practical ways to tackle it? So I guess the first question is to take a step back and say, okay, how did I get into this situation?
Right. How did this happen?
How did this happen? So what are the obvious reasons why people get into debt problems?
Well, I mean, the most obvious one is that you haven't got a sufficient income. And so that either means you're not earning enough, or perhaps you've lost your job, or for some reason, like the inflation we're experiencing these days, your costs have got out of line and your income can't change overnight. And
I think we've been saying this for years, and that is
since 1999.
Since
anybody's
1999,
asking.
yeah. So what are we in? Like year 25 now of Hoyes Michalos?
Hey, you got to speak louder. I can't hear you anymore.
We started when we were 6, so we're not as old as we look here. We're both 30. Our clients obviously have debt problems. That's why they're filing a consumer proposal or bankruptcy.
Right.
But more than that, what they really have is an income problem.
That's right. The underlying issue always has to be if you're spending money faster than you're making it, well, obviously you need to find a way to either make more money or reduce your spending. And I guess that would be the second reason. Your spending's out of control for some reason.
Yeah. And they're, and I think the perception, if you talk to someone on the street, is, oh, well, if someone's gone bankrupt, it's because they had a, huge spending problem. They're impulsive. They've got a gambling problem, right? All those sorts of things.
Basically, they're blaming the person who's gotten into bankruptcy.
Right. And, certainly there are people who fit that bill exactly, but that would be the distinct minority, I think, of the people that we deal with.
Yeah, there's lots of room to share the blame. I put the blame more on the fact that you can get 27 credit cards if you apply for them. Mm-hmm. And so, okay, there's somebody else is at fault here, not just you for applying for them.
Yeah, and we did a show back in December about credit cards and, all the new ways you can now pay with installments and all the new ways to do it. So it's certainly an issue. So today's product, installment loans for credit cards. Now, 5 minutes ago, had you ever heard of that?
I had never heard of that. I'm still not sure what the hell you're talking about.
So I hand Ted cue cards, and here we go. So he's going to learn about this as we go. Now, we don't actually have a deal set up with any of the big banks.
So we haven't quite figured that part out.
No, we haven't quite nailed it. But I'm hoping that they will watch
out of the
this
goodness
show,
of their hearts.
Exactly, and offer us lots of money. So I'm going to start with my new best friends at CIBC.
Okay.
A wonderful institution, if CIBC is watching. They have this new thing called CIBC PACEIT, which is trademarked.
Okay.
Other companies have it. We'll talk about those too. So it's an installment plan for your CIBC credit card. Okay.
Okay, that sounds okay.
Sounds okay. So here's how it works. You go online and you sign up for the PACEIT program.
Okay.
So you got to, fill in some forms or whatever. And then you can look at all of your transactions, and they'll have a little tag beside them on screen.
These are all my transactions on my CIBC card.
On your CIBC credit card, that's right, that says eligible for installment. And in order to be eligible, well, it has to be over a certain amount. I don't know if CIBC has the same limit as everyone else, tends to be around $150, something like that. So, okay, this particular transaction, that lawnmower you bought at Home Depot yesterday for $400.
Are we expecting a check from Home Depot?
Yes, Home Depot. Fantastic. See, I'm getting the hang of this.
There you go.
We're going to make some money on this podcast. So I click on the button and say, yes, I would like to turn that one transaction into an installment loan.
Right.
And then it says, which type would you like? So you can do 6 monthly payments, 5.99% interest, 12 monthly payments, 6.99% interest, or 24 payments, 24 months, 7.99% interest. And of course, there's also a 1.5% one-time installment fee for the purchase. So on the surface, this seems fantastic because my normal credit card has an interest rate of 19% or whatever it is. So rather than buying the thing and paying 19% interest, now I can buy the thing and pay perhaps 6% interest. Right. So what's the problem? Is this not the most fantastic thing you've ever heard with my new friends at CIBC?
Where do you want to start? Wherever I like?
Wherever you like.
Right. Well, let's start with this extra purchase fee then. So I'm buying this thing for $1,000 and I put it on my CIBC credit card. Now, unless I'm mistaken, somebody has paid a transaction fee to CIBC for using that credit card. We know the merchants complained about it, and there was recent legislation allowing them to pass that fee on to me, but you and I both know that the fee was already buried in the cost of the item anyway.
Exactly right. And we did a show on that, I don't know, a few weeks ago. And you're right. So the merchant is paying 1%, 2%, 3%, whatever it is.
Right.
On every purchase that you're making.
And so now I'm paying an admin fee of 1.5% of the purchase price for the privilege of paying them back this money at a lower interest rate.
Right. Could be saving up for the lawnmower before putting it on credit.
Or at least make some decisions that, okay, I mean, the example I was giving you go to Costco and it's over the $150, so you put the whole thing on there. Well, probably you bought a bunch of groceries. So now you're doing a monthly payment plan on your groceries. I'm not sure that makes any sense for anybody.
That sounds risky to me. Well, if my car gets a flat tire.
You need a tire.
I need a tire. And if I need my car to get to work because my shift starts at 5 a.m. and the buses don't start running till 6, then that I would say is a need.
Yep.
And I have no idea how much I guess if they're fixing the tire, it's cheaper than if I have to buy a new one. And if I'm buying one, I'm probably buying 4 because that's how cars work.
Yep.
And because eventually they go, and I don't really want to be driving around on bald tires. In fact, I didn't tell you, but I had my car in on Friday.
Yeah, you getting your snows, weren't you?
Yep, getting my snows, and apparently my ball joint was busted. I think that's what it was. And there's an arm that attaches to it or something.
Sure.
And I was wondering why I always had to have the steering wheel in a non-straight up position. I'm thinking, okay, they're probably true. I actually trust the guys at the place I take my car to.
Right.
And I do have 240,000 kilometers on it. So that thing would probably break at some point, right?
Yep.
So, that is probably a need.
It certainly is.
And it cost more than $150.
Yep.
And so...
And you couldn't necessarily plan for it.
No.
I mean, you can if you put up a maintenance schedule when you first buy the car. This is what I'm going to have to do every month. Nobody does that.
Well, that was 12 years ago. And so I didn't factor that into the process. So in this case, I put it on my credit card and I will pay it off at the end of the month and that'll be that.
Right.
But I guess that would be a classic case where, if I had to...
Yep.
Then this would be a case that perhaps I would use it. So, what then is your overall conclusion on this? How do I decide whether or not I should be taking advantage of a credit card installment loan or not?
Well, so whenever a company introduces a new product or service, they're doing it because they think they can make more money using it. And so don't do something because it's to the company's advantage. Make sure it's to your advantage. So it means looking at what's my overall debt picture? What's my overall monthly cash flow picture? I was going to buy this lawnmower because that's the example we keep using and put it on my credit card and deal with it. Well, now I'm talking about setting up a separate monthly payment just for the credit card, just for the lawnmower. And I've got to make sure that I can balance all these things. It may actually make sense to do it. I'm not saying that it doesn't, but do it because it's something that works to your advantage, not because I'm trying to sell it to you.
I don't think you should have 12 credit cards so that you can have the highest credit score.
Interesting philosophy.
Well, and it may increase, it does increase your borrowing ability.
Right.
And therefore lowers your utilization if you're not carrying balances on all of them. But of course, at some point it gets too high and that starts to harm your credit score.
Right.
So my practical advice is I'm a big believer in paying your credit card frequently. Mm-hmm. Because then you can't get into any trouble. It's as simple as that.
If the cash is out of your bank account, you can't spend it on something else.
Yep.
Remember what we told you. Credit is a replacement for cash. It's not a replacement for borrowing.
So I guess from a safety point of view, what you want is a low authorized limit.
Yep.
So if the bank says, "Hey, congratulations, we're gonna raise you from 5,000 to 10,000," you could say, "Thanks, bank. You know what? I'm happy at the 5."
Right.
And I realize that's not going to help you maximize your credit score because now you're going to have lower utilization, but it also prevents you from spending more than what you realistically want to do. Okay, so we are both licensed insolvency trustees.
Mm-hmm.
Do you find it troubling when credit card levels continue to go up? Or is it like, oh, well, that's just the way it is? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, effectively, it means that regardless of how much the banks and other financial institutions say they're involved in financial literacy, people still don't get it. I mean, if you take a moment and you say, I want to buy this item, but I'm going to put it on my credit card, and you realize you can't pay the balance off at the end of the month, then you have to add the interest charges from the credit card to the cost of purchasing that item. And nobody ever does that because it's too complicated.
Well, and a bank would not have any incentive to teach you that.
Oh, no financial house does, right?
And a merchant would not have any incentive to teach you that.
That's right. They all market that this is the payment. You can afford the payment.
And I believe we've done the math on previous shows. If I buy something for $1,000 and the interest rate is 20% on the credit card, and I'm going to carry a balance for 5 years until I pay it off, then I don't know, I'm probably paying close to double what the thing cost.
And that's how mortgages work.
For fixed rate mortgages, the average increase in payments at renewal will be the biggest in 2025, 2026.
Right.
Okay, well, that kind of makes sense because if you in 2020 got a 5-year mortgage,
if you were smart enough to lock it in,
then I guess 2025 is when it's going to hit.
Right.
For variable rate mortgages, the average increase depends on whether the payments are variable or fixed.
Right.
And this is something a bunch of people don't seem to grasp. So variable payments means your payment changes every single month.
It fluctuates.
Well, obviously, those borrowers have already experienced an increase in payments of close to 50%.
Right.
With the bulk of the increase obviously taking place over the last year. Fixed payments, these borrowers will need to increase their payments by approximately 40% to maintain their original amortization schedule, assuming a renewal in 2025 or 2026. Now, again, it all depends when you started, where you're at. These are all...
Yep. Well, and the impact on the fixed payments is more and more of your payments been going towards the interest. Mm-hmm. In fact, some of them are probably underwater on the interest, right?
And amortizations have had to be rolled out. Now, the point is that virtually every mortgage that's coming up for renewal is going to be at a higher rate. You glossed over the obvious solution here because you said, well, everybody needs a place to live. You can't just sell your house.
Right.
Well, sure you can.
Yep. Or at least you can try.
So what's wrong with that option?
Well, it's not necessarily a bad option. It depends on the priority you place on owning your own home. But before you put your house up for sale, look to where you want to live or where you are living to figure out what's available for rent and how much it's going to cost you. I mean, rents have increased faster than interest rates. And so it's difficult to find some place to live at an affordable rate.
Yeah, obviously we've had massive immigration into Canada, and so that puts pressure on rental supply. And if house prices are out of control, I can't buy a house. So what do I do is I rent.
Right.
So that puts pressure on the rental market. But in most cases, rental rate, well, no, this may be totally inaccurate what I'm about to say, but in general, rental rates are less than owning rates.
Yes,
because you got to pay the mortgage, the property taxes, maintenance.
I mean, the math we used to use was it's about 25% less per month to rent versus owning. So factoring in taxes, maintenance, all the things that you were just talking about.
So $1,000 mortgage payment would equate to maybe $750 in rent. And obviously there's no place to rent for $1,000 a month, but
right.
And landlords, people who own condos and rent them out, are, if they bought the condo 2 years ago, they're absolutely for sure negative on the cash flow if they didn't have a massive down payment on it.
Right.
So they're losing money, which kind of proves the point that it is cheaper to rent than to own in the short term. So your advice is, okay, where could I rent? And maybe I can't rent the house next door where I'm living now because it's not up for rent. Do I have to move to a different school district, whatever? But if I can do that and sell my house, I got to make sure I'm actually getting some money when I sell it, I guess, too.
Well, you got to be able to clear up whatever your obligations are that have been putting you underwater.
And I know when I have that discussion with someone, you don't just come out and say it. Well, why don't you sell your house?
Right.
It's, well, let's look at all the different options.
Yeah, and I always predicate it with, well, you know, one of the things we have to look at, even though if you're not seriously interested, is what happens if you were to sell the house. Mm-hmm. And then you walk them into that whole nature of the conversation. But it's a difficult conversation to have.
And I always make sure that I get them to do the math for me.
Right.
So how much is your mortgage payment? How much is property taxes, condo fees, whatever? How old is the furnace? Have you ever had to fix the roof? All that kind of stuff. And let them come up with the numbers.
Right.
Is my mortgage payment higher or lower, all else being equal, if I'm paying weekly, bi-weekly, monthly? How does that work?
Well, so if you are, the more frequently you're making the payment, the lower your interest costs overall are going to be because you're paying down the principal on an accelerated rate. The total payment you're making in a month, though, might actually be higher. So let's say you're paying $1,000 a month and you switch to $250 weekly. Well, in fact, you're going to be paying on average, what is that? About $1,100.
Yeah,
because every every 6th month you get that third payment.
Well, yeah, if you're paying weekly 4 times a year, you get 5 payments.
Yeah, 4.3 per month anyway.
Right. And if you're paying bi-weekly, then it happens twice a year that you get 3 times where you're making the payment.
Right.
So if you are currently paying weekly $250,
right,
and you switch to monthly $1,000, well, I guess you're saving yourself $250 4 times a year.
Yep. And the trade-off is so you're saving that in your immediate cash flow, but you're increasing your interest costs correspondingly over the long term.
So then what's your advice? What's your advice for someone who has a mortgage but also has other unsecured debts?
So let's fall back on the famous saying that cash is king. So if the reason you're having problems making all of your payments is because you've just got too many payments, maybe we can do something about those lines of credit, credit cards, personal loans. I noticed you didn't mention payday loans. You're just not trying to push my buttons today.
Didn't want to say the P word.
It may very well be that if we do something to deal with all of your other debts, maybe the mortgage can become manageable. And so what we're talking about is a consumer proposal.
So someone comes into you and they've got $50,000 worth of unsecured debt. So again, credit cards, payday loans, income taxes, bank loans, whatever.
Yep.
And they own a house. If the house explain to me how equity is going to factor into that then.
Well, so whenever you're offering your creditors some sort of deal through a proposal where you're saying, look, I can't pay my original contracts, I'm going to pay back part of my debt, we have to look to see, well, what would they be entitled to if you liquidated your assets? So if you sold your house and there's money left over, that's effectively equity. And so if you want to be able to keep your house, well, let's go in the example. So the person came in and they've got that $50,000 you were talking about. If we do the math and figure out there's $25,000 worth of equity if the house is sold, then the creditors, the people you owe, are not going to agree to anything less than what they'd get if the house was sold. So they're going to want that $25,000. If it turns out there's no equity, well, then that $50,000 we can probably offer to repay as little as $15,000. It all depends on your circumstances.
And that's what the world looked like in 2011.
Right.
Because when people came in to see us, their house price wasn't worth a whole lot more than what was owing on the mortgage.
Yep.
So we were able to do a proposal. When they came in to see us, last year, and their house was worth $1 million and the mortgage was $300,000, well, there's no deal to be made. So if I've got $50,000 worth of credit card and other unsecured debt, and the equity in my house is $100,000, and I go to the creditors and I say, I'd like to do a proposal of $30,000, $500 a month spread over 5 years.
Why would they agree to that when they know you've got lots of equity in your house?
Right, because if they decline the proposal and you end up having to go bankrupt, they're going to get all their money.
Right.
So the general principle in a proposal is exactly what you said. You've got to offer more than they would get in a bankruptcy, or at the very least, the full amount of the debt.
Well, and the full amount of the debt can mean different things as well. Normally, when we offer one of these proposals to your creditors, that's the example you just had where you have $50,000 worth of credit card debt. We would offer to pay back the $50,000 because you have $100,000 in equity. The creditors may agree to that, or the creditors may come back and say, you know what? We'd also like all the fees to be covered as well, in which case that $50,000 is probably going to jump up to $63,000 or $64,000.
Yeah, because in a consumer proposal, we get paid.
Right.
That's how it works. Our fees are set by the government. Every licensed insolvency trustee gets the same percentage as what's in the pot, and it works out to something in excess of about 20% of the payments that go out to the creditor.
Can they refinance? So would they qualify for a second mortgage, or could they refinance their first? That $200,000 worth of equity, well, if it's 10% of the house's value, they probably can't refinance. If it's 40% of the house's value, then they probably can. So we'd look at that first because that's a reasonable place to begin.
So let's talk about the refinancing then. Yep. And so we would suggest you talk to someone who is an expert in that.
Right. Talk to your bank.
Or a mortgage broker or whatever. I mean, we've had Ron Butler on the show before. The bank knows you.
Right.
So, and if you already have your first mortgage with the bank, then it may be a relatively simple matter for them to bump up the first mortgage.
Right.
Or they've already got registered, might not be that hard to do a second mortgage, a HELOC, something like that. A mortgage broker can shop the market and can go to a whole bunch of different lenders.
Including private funding.
Right. And the bank has rules to follow.
Right.
And the rule is we're only going to lend up to this percentage of whatever the house is worth.
Because they have to prepare if something goes wrong, are they going to be covered?
And they're also looking at what your income is, a bunch of other factors. Whereas a private lender might go, I don't care what your income is, I only care what the house is worth.
Yeah. I know that Doug is going to do what he can to keep the damn house. Everything else will go in the pot, but Doug will keep the house.
And so there are some private lenders who only care about the equity in the house. There are some private lenders who only care about your own income because that's what you're going to support it.
Right.
So a mortgage broker can get you perhaps a different deal than what you would get at the bank. So that's the first step.
Right.
Figure out what is the house worth and then talk to the appropriate lenders to see if it's possible to refinance.
Yep.
Now, let's say that either they say, no, you don't have enough equity. We only lend up to 90% loan to value and you're over that limit. Or they say, yeah, sure, we can give you a second mortgage. The interest rate is going to be a gazillion %.
Yeah, that's the thing to watch for.
Which is just going to make it even worse.
Yep.
And some of these, well, a lot of the second tier lenders now who aren't banks are in the second mortgage business.
Yep.
And the interest rates are very, very high. That's exactly why we wanted to do this show today, to explain that, there are some traps that you may not be aware of. And I think everyone intuitively understands, well, yeah, high interest is a problem, but okay, it's not just the high interest, it's combining with time that gets into the situation. And so, yeah, look at options to deal with it on your own. If you can, fantastic. If you've still got good credit and can do a rollover, not in the vehicle sense, but in the sense of taking a low interest line of credit and using that money to pay off a credit card, great.
The term debt consolidation has become this comfort term in modern consumer debt culture. And, it's promoted to help debt. And never mind that it is debt. It's replacement debt, but it makes it feel like you've got control, I think. And that's what the appeal is for people who are desperate.
The reason someone would get a debt consolidation loan is they've got multiple payments on 3 different credit cards. This consolidates it all into one. And the second reason would be, well, if I've got 3 credit cards at high interest rates and I can get a consolidation loan at a lower interest rate, I'm going to pay less interest, pay it off simpler.
Yep.
Okay, so that makes perfect sense. So why then is this harmful? What types of debt consolidation loans would be harmful? What's the problem here?
Well, the issue is behavior. So, and the issue is also what was the cause or the source of the problem in the first place? And it's almost always cash flow, as we find. You mention this all the time. It was in your book that people's income are not sufficient once you build up a certain mass of debt to deal with that debt or to get ahead. And so they're bad if you don't get rid of the previous debts. Okay, if you fall back into resorting to credit since your cash flow issues haven't been addressed. So in other words, we see a lot of consolidation loans where they're never just the consolidation loan. Nobody comes into us and says, I got $30,000 in debt and it's all one consolidation loan. Never happened. They always have other debts, whether they didn't cut up their old ones and rebuilt the balances again because their cash flow wasn't fixed or enough to help, or they went and got new debts because they realized, again, their cash flow wasn't enough. So it's also bad if you do it at high interest with those nasty installment loans. And really, you're just swapping debt for debt. So unless there's some kind of material gain, either in interest rates or cash flow or thereof both, then really that's why they'd be harmful.
You remember good old episode 429 a few weeks ago where we talked about credit card installment loans.
Yeah, right.
You weren't a big fan of those either, as I recall, but at least the interest isn't horrific on those.
Yet.
So we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on that. But again, I'm thinking about getting an installment loan, so I'm not necessarily consolidating other debts. I'm not buying a car.
Right.
What is the thought process I should go to when I'm deciding whether or not to get that kind of loan?
So anytime you borrow, what's the purpose of the loan? So is it actually worth it to you to be borrowing this money and paying somebody interest for whatever it is you're using the loan to cover? Can you actually afford the payment? So again, think this through. They're going to make it sound like the payment's quite manageable, but you got to factor in all of your other costs. And of course, who are you borrowing from? So are you borrowing from a Schedule A bank? Are you borrowing from lots of money for free on the internet? That's 49%.
You don't have any Italian heritage in you, do you?
Just a little. Sicilian.
Theodorus?
I just want people to know how we got here. Like, why are installment loans, the 48% ones which are just proliferating in the last few years? The reason they're proliferating is partly and largely due to the Ontario government back in whatever year, the last decade, made an attempt to crack down on payday lenders. And so they put in a bunch of laws at Queen's Park that were meant to be helpful to consumers regarding payday loans. But what they did was they drove two things. They drove payday lenders online more than they were, like a lot more, because some of the legislation was due to, like, you couldn't borrow from the same physical store twice and all this stuff. And what they really did, though, is they said, payday lenders went, okay, then we'll just loan people more money. It won't be 391% interest like on a traditional payday loan. It'll be 48, but it'll be 12 grand. And in our example you saw earlier, even if you just pay 1 year of that 3-year loan, you're going to pay them all of the interest that you owe. Like, they're going to, even if you drop the loan after that and go bankrupt, they're going to have made money off you. And so what it inadvertently did was drove them into bigger lending. And that appealed to people because consumer debt has gone up. And so if consumer debt is now, our typical client comes to see us is high 40s in unsecured debt, much higher for homeowners, but we see far fewer homeowners, then offering me a $5,000, $10,000 or $15,000 loan opens my eyes. Even if the interest rate is terrible, like we said, and the implications, well, I don't quite see the implications of paying $14,000 to borrow 10, but that's what it did, is it drove the payday lenders to do that. It drove the secondary lenders to really up their game in terms of offering these bigger installment loans to people, just because of that appeal to people to say, oh, I'm solving my problem, right? I'm borrowing this amount to either, address a major expense that I have suddenly, or to consolidate other debts, which is not a great idea, but you don't think that way at the time.
Your idea of having one page right on the very front that has a big font,
right, and it's going to be simple.
And really simple. The annual interest rate is 39%. I mean, we have it on credit card statements now. If you just make the minimum payment, this is how many years it will take you to pay it off.
Right. So the bank shouldn't mind a suggestion.
It's already exists for them, really.
Right.
And you and I know, we talk to a lot of clients and we say, so why did you finally call us? You've had all this debt for many years. It's like, well, I was reading my statement and it's going to be 52 years before I'm paid off this debt.
Right.
And, I'm 60 years old now. I don't know if I'm going to live to be 112 or not. So I'd like to deal with this now.
I mean, one of the marketing thrusts from anybody selling anything these days is, can you afford the payment? They don't tell you what it's costing you. They just want to know, can you afford the payment? This sort of disclosure does away with all that.
Right. I got that high interest loan because the payment is only $200 a paycheck.
I can handle that.
That's easy.
You can't, but
whereas if you said you're borrowing $5,000, but you're going to pay back $15,000,
right,
then that puts it in different perspective. So on this one-page, bold-faced, big font form, it says the annual interest rate is X, and I guess the second line would be the total payments you will make is Y. Are those the two things you'd have on the form?
So, and it would be amount borrowed, amount paid back, and the difference. But you'd also, to compensate for loans that are 3 to 6 months, you'd have to be what you're really paying and then showing it as an annualized as well.
Really, what this comes down to is people are watching this. They got a bunch of debt. Okay, what do you do? How do you start? What's the first thing you should do when you start to notice you got a lot of debt? And probably for a lot of people, it's a feeling of unease. It's like, okay, I know things are going off the rails. What do I do? So before we get into the specific methods, do you have any big picture comments you want to start us with as to what someone should do when they are faced with a bunch of debt?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what I would call it is doing like a personal assessment. You want to understand where you actually stand. Now, this is a bunch of different things, and I think we could go on for a long time, but what it comes down to is, can you make yourself a list of the debts so you can understand who you owe money to and how much? And do you have a sense of what your income is and what your basic living expenses are? That's going to be your starting point. Where do I actually stand right now, and what can I do next?
And usually when you do that, it becomes pretty obvious. It's like, okay, I got $3,000 coming in and $5,000 going out. I got a problem. I got to deal with it. So There are two methods that the gurus write about. and you can give me your thoughts on both of these. One is the Snowball method, and the other is the Avalanche method, because they all have to have a winter theme, I guess, right? That's what it comes down to.
That can only be cold.
It can only be cold, absolutely. So before we talk about each of them, what is your general opinion of both of those concepts?
Well, my general opinion, I can sum up this way. I can never keep those two terms straight. I have to look them up because to me, they are gimmicks. It's just, I don't know, does it sell a book maybe? Or does it get a person to click on an article? It's certainly not methods that are actually overly helpful in most cases. They have their differences and there is some value to them, but it's a kind of a gimmicky phrasing, I think.
Okay, there we go. They're gimmicks. So we'll definitely try to make the title of this show something like Debt Snowball versus Avalanche or something, so that we can get all the clickbait stuff. So
we want a debt sunset, don't we?
Oh, absolutely. That'd be good. So let's start with the Snowball method. And you're right. I have to look them up too whenever I talk about them. So I'll give you a hint. The Snowball method prioritizes balances. Okay.
Yes.
That's the difference. So what is the Snowball method? And I'll give you the scenario. I got 5 different debts. That's the scenario.
Mm-hmm. So here's what you're wanting to do if you're looking into the Snowball method. You want to line those debts up by the size of the debt. We're not worried at this stage about the minimum payment or necessarily the interest rate. We're looking at the volume of the debt. You've got, let's say, you got an $800 payday loan, $2,000 credit card, $5,000 line of credit, etc. The idea in the Snowball method is you're going to try and make your minimum payments on everything. This is a really key point with both of these, is you're not going to neglect any debt if you can avoid it. But any extra cash that you have within whatever your spending limits are, you're going to put that money against those smaller debts. You're going to get rid of them one at a time. You're going to snowball to the next highest debt with what that payment was. You're going to just try and work on them a piece at a time. It draws into the debt side is if you are paying the smallest debt and not paying attention to the size of the interest on the debt that you're paying, there is a serious risk that it's going to take you more time and cost you more money to get out of debt, because really what is the harmful part of debt is the interest rate, how much money you're paying to owe it. So if you are going after the small stuff instead of the larger interest, you might actually be costing yourself more money and time.
In the debt avalanche method, you are prioritizing interest. So tell me the story again, but this time prioritize interest.
Yeah. So in this method, the plan would be not to line up the debts based on the size of the debt, but on the interest rate. And again, the purpose here is to stay on top of everything. So you're wanting to make your minimum payments on all of them, but you're wanting to take any extra free cash flow and put it towards the highest interest debts first, because the more you pay off on the higher interest rate debt, the less interest you will accumulate the next month and going forward. It will save you money over time.
Okay, It's going to take me 17 lifetimes, I think, to pay that off.
Right.
So how do I calculate what the upper limit is when, you know what, neither method is going to work for me?
It's an excellent question. And I'm going to use another term I like, critical mass. I think there is a critical mass of debt for any individual or family that once you go beyond that massive debt, you're simply never going to pay it off. It's not going to work. You're going to need another method. Now, there's a few different ways that you could measure this. You could measure income versus total debt. You could measure certain ratios and so on. And honestly, that gets too complicated for me to really figure out. But here's my method of figuring it out. If you take your monthly net income and you subtract from that your most vital expenses, we all know what those are. You got to live somewhere. You got to eat something. You probably have places to go. And then you look at your minimum payments, your absolute minimum payments, before you start talking about throwing money at other debts. Well, if the expenses and the minimum debt payments are higher than the income, you have reached critical mass. You no longer get the benefit of either a debt snowball or a debt avalanche method, because there's no extra money to pay down those debts.
So on this podcast, as you know, we spend a lot of time talking about consumer proposals.
Right.
And why is that?
Well, because it's a very useful solution for most people's debt problems.
Because we make a lot of money doing
you could also say that we
proposals.
make a lot of money selling
Right.
computer proposals.
Sorry, let's go with your answer. It is a very useful solution for most people's debts.
It is how we get paid.
But yes, I mean, we will start the show by saying that we are biased.
Yep.
This is a significant portion, certainly more than half of the income of Hoyes Michalos and Associates,
right,
by a significant margin. So, okay, it could be that we think this is a great solution because we get paid for this great solution, right?
But then we'd be telling everybody to do it. So, I mean, we're biased, but not to the extent that you're, alluding to.
That is true. When people phone us, of the people who call us, it is, certainly less than a third of them who end up filing a consumer proposal.
And I'd like to think we always give people the right answer. And based on most of our testimonials, I think people would agree that that's the case.
Well, so let's put that to the test today, and we are going to compare, and let's see if we can actually prove that, yes, the solution we have is the correct one.
Okay.
Now, it's not going to be the correct one in every case, as you just said.
Right.
So when is it the correct one? When isn't? That's the question. So the question is, I've got some debts. Do I need to do a consumer proposal, or can I just work them out on my own? Now, if you have enough money to pay them on your own, then yes, obviously, that's what you should do. Pay them back. What we're talking about, though, is a situation where, I don't have quite enough money to pay them back in full. So I would like to negotiate a lesser amount, which is what a consumer proposal is.